Welcome back to Great Karate Myths, Debunking the Legends. Today, we're diving into a piece of karate history that marks a significant fork in the road. Ten No Kata. Often overlooked, or in some styles, completely dropped, this kata, created by Funakoshi Sensei, is a deliberate break from the antique forms. It's more than just a set of basics. It's the physical embodiment of the philosophy of Karatedo, the way of karate. Funakoshi Sensei believed that mastering this one form could unlock the true meaning of the art. Was its creation a corruption of the old ways, or the brilliant essential foundation for the ethical karate we need today? Join us as we unpack the history, purpose, and profound influence of this pivotal creation. We'll explore why this kata is seen as possibly the first pure empty hand karate form, its connection to the idea of no first attack, and why its simple systematic structure was a stroke of genius that shaped the entire martial arts world. Okay, Matt, first question from you.
Well, I suppose really the first most basic question is what is it? And I suppose we can get into why it was created, but when was it created? I think I'd like to try and situate it historically in comparison to, the other kata that were emerging around that time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as far as I'm aware, the looking at Funakoshi Gichin Sensei's early publication. So let's do the second question first. When was it created? So and I could be wrong here, but so I'm not an expert. This is not really particularly my field, but when Funakoshi Sensei published Karate Rentan Goshin Jutsu, I think that was 1925. I don't recall Ten No Kata being in that, but it certainly was in Karatedo Kihon. It was published in 1935. Whether that attests to it being created during that period or not, I don't actually know. But that would be a sort of ballpark period of time between 1925 and 1935, where it appears in Karatedo Kihon. Then secondly, what is it? Well, Funakoshi Gichin Sensei doesn't designate it as a traditional kata. In fact, he says that it patently is not a traditional kata. But I think the thrust of it was, pun intended, was to create something in the way of a basic approach to karate. And we'll come on to what the significance of that later in the conversation. So it was created primarily it was created to provide a set of quotes, basics.
So basics based on the idea of fundamental techniques. Is that what you think it was put together to teach people?
Well, on examination, there's just on observation of the structure of the kata. It's almost Tom, in a previous podcast, and we've all discussed the challenges of making a kata, and the Ten No Kata sort of it seems to be represent the thinking that many of us would take, and many homegrown styles over the last 70 or 80 years have taken when faced with the challenge of trying to create kata. They're looking for a basics. I remember teaching at I was up at in Iffley Road in the Oxford University dojo. I was teaching there, and I was teaching a couple of chaps who come from a homegrown style, and their teacher had created their kata, and they had a sort of an elbowing kata and a knee kata and a punching kata and a blocking kata. So the creator of that style, and the name of it escapes memory, but that had been done with a very linear thinking process being employed. And Ten No Kata is I'm not going to deride it, but it's far from it. But it's you can see it's a very linear creation in terms of the thinking. So here's the basic punch. Then there are 6 blocks. Yeah, 3 at lower and middle level, and 3 at upper level. And it sort of appears to be what a beginner might, or what the teacher believes that the beginner might need to assimilate or learn or know. And one can see that looking at what were previously the introductory kata in Shotokan karate, before the creation of the Taekwondo kata, again by Funakoshi Gichin Sensei, the first kata was the Pinan series of 5 of them. Strange way to learn sort of a systematic way of practicing self-defense. Anyone familiar with the Pinan will still find them enigmatic, to say the least. And there, for every practitioner, there's an application or an idea, and that's fine. In fact, some people say that's what that material was designed to create. Personally, I think that sowing seeds of confusion in the early stages of learning kata is an error. So Ten No Kata presents as a set of fundamentals or basics, which is and it seems to have it's occurred sometime between 1925 and 1935. It's not actually by 1943. In 1943, Funakoshi Gichin Sensei published it in Japan, and the idea was that the reader could actually learn karate from the book, could actually learn the basics of karate from his book, Karatedo Nailmon. That was in part the idea, and he wanted to reach a larger public, and so he published it in 1943. And he says it in the book that he gives a detailed explanation, as he says, of only one kata, Ten No Kata, and he basically says that if you took only the Ten No Kata and practiced it, I can't quite quote him, but with all of your heart until you mastered it, then Funakoshi Gichin Sensei says that he could, that without reserve, he believed that one could realize the true meaning of Karatedo, and this was the position he held. So karate, so Ten No Kata was actually designed to be quite a bit more than just a set of basics, but one can see that was the starting point, was to codify, was to create a systematic set of basics for the teaching and practice of karate.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that's quite a significant departure from the subject of our previous conversations, the anti kata. The Ten No Kata is very, very different, and obviously a later creation. But the idea of breaking it down into basics, it just seems quite, it's sort of different. It's born of a different mindset, maybe I'll say, from the older kata, the ones that we've been closely examining.
Indeed, and I would suggest that the the very creation of Ten No Kata evidences that a meaningful set of basics, quotes, basics for ballistic punch, block, kick, strike, so-called unarmed self-defense was woefully absent, couldn't easily be understood from the existing kata. And actually, prior to the creation of the Pinan kata between 1905 and 1908 by Itosu Anko Sensei, the beginner, according to Nagamine Shoshi, the Matsubayashi Shorin-ryu Sensei, the late Matsubayashi Shorin-ryu Sensei, prior to the creation of the Pinan kata, developed by 1908, the beginner used to actually learn Naihanshin. So originally, the beginner, the karate beginner, learned Naihanshin, or for Shotokan practitioners, Teki Shodan through to Sandan, and for Wado-ryu practitioners, that they only do Teki Shodan. But effectively, that was the beginner's kata. And that's a strange way to begin the art of unarmed ballistic self-defense. And I think the creation of the Ten No Kata is tantamount to an admission that a cohesive, logical set of basics for approaching teaching the art, not particularly practicing, but teaching the art of karate, that set of a coherent set of basics was absent. And so I think that the creation of Ten No Kata, and this will be my main point, it is evidence that the teachers and practitioners could not find what they actually were looking for in the kata in terms of an introduction to beginners or for beginners, and a set of basics. And it's from that Ten No Kata approach that the whole idea, the Kihon, the idea of a basic technique, basics, evolved. And that set of basics had to be created, and it was created. And although not every style does the actual routine, the kata, Ten No Kata, if you look at all of the styles right the way through to the later Korean Taekwondo, you'll find this similar sets of basics, all performed usually marching up and down in sort of semi-military drill, with repetitions of the same sets of blocks and counter attacks that were first found in Funakoshi Gichin Sensei's Ten No Kata.
What, Tom, you got any notes on it?
I mean, the point's been well made there by Nathan, but just to add to it, I think that the Ten No Kata is a good body of evidence that they had no idea what the antique forms were for, because it's through the fundamental karate method born out of Ten No Kata type karate that they access the antique forms. So you've got the Ten No Kata, and then you've got the two-man set, the applications for it, the attacks and the blocks and counters and so on. And that seems to be the leaping off point to then perform or use movements from the antique forms. So you can see it in the developing Shotokan, in the Best Karate series, where they go through the antique kata, and it's all against techniques that really, the lunge punch and reverse punch and things like that, using those blocks and counters and things like that. So if the antique forms were kind of an open book, you wouldn't find applications based on a stepping punch or a stepping reverse punch or anything like that. This wouldn't exist. So in order for karate to really be more fully developed, you had to have something like Ten No Kata. Otherwise, there wouldn't really be. There'd just still be a bunch of kata. without the functions. And the Penans also. I mean, we've talked about the Penans before, highlighting the fact that they're a mix up, a mash up of antique material, which doesn't really. Once the function is known, you couldn't mash up. So the Ten No Kata is really quite a brilliant way of creating a practice, a karate practice. And I think that Gichin Funakoshi's experiences in Japan, seeing Budo, like judo and kendo and the martial arts that he saw, it added to the necessity that there had to become, karate had to be developed almost from scratch. You had the antique forms, but they weren't fighting with them. They couldn't do anything with them. So they created something you could fight with. And Shotokan, is a very powerful. It's very impressive. It's very powerful, and the Ten No Kata becomes almost a ballistic key to do something with the antique forms. So if you know Ten No Kata, you've got some attacks and you've got some distancing and you've got some stances, and then you can play with the antique form. You could, if you didn't know what they were for, you could take a move, some kusanku, and defend yourself with or counter with some of the movements from kus, but you would always use the attacks from Ten No Kata. So it's quite brilliant, really, in terms of the development of karate. And I mean, Nathan mentions the Karatedo Nyomon, the introduction to karate, as being a sort of self-contained manual, and Gichin Funakoshi sets up everything with the stories of the masters dueling and using the nukite, the spear hand, and the anecdotes. And so you've got that you can almost embody that in your Ten No Kata practice, because there's stories of people squaring off and then someone steps and does an attack and it's like a thunderous punch, but the master moves out the way, blocks it and counters it and stops the punch short of the, it's great stuff, but it's just stories that kind of add some life and myth to the Ten No Kata. And and again, adding to Nathan's point where he mentions Gichin Funakoshi saying, if you master the Ten No Kata, you get to the heart of it. You can understand all kata. And it's kind of true, because you've got to weigh into the antique forms if you don't know what they're for. And then the whole styles have been built out of it, which is just quite fascinating, really. It's quite a brilliant piece of work. And the introduction to karate is just such a fascinating text as well. So the thinking is quite brilliant, I think. Anyway, that's just my view. Yeah.
Yeah, here, Tom. Couldn't agree more. And I think the Ten No Kata, the Karatedo Nailman, the master introductory text, as it was subtitled in the 1988 Kodanshu edition. I think it was the first time it appeared in English, actually. It was as late as 1988. But there's an interesting foreword that's copied over from Hiranishi Montanobu, Genshin Hiranishi, who was one of the stalwarts of the old founding Shotokan crew. He was a contemporary of Yoshitaka, Funakoshi Sensei, son. I think he was the third son, if I'm not mistaken. But he wrote. He had changed his practice in later life, but he spoke about the value of Ten No Kata in terms of mai, or the distance, and he described a practice called if I get this. It's basically, I think, when I was in the early 70s, I think we called it irimi, but I think later the Shotokai called it kawashi, a form of interaction in which, according to Hironishi Sensei, it's almost as though the attacker and the defender change places. It's basically an emphasis on timing, distance, and evasion, which was really at the heart of the version of Shotokan created by Igami Shigeru, later became known as Shotokai, which happened after World War II, and basically created a completely new style. But that style did retain the Ten No Kata, whereas mainstream Shotokan karate dropped it completely. Interestingly, the Ten No Kata does occur in a 1967 publication by the karate luminary Henry Plea, which Tom was very kind to. Tom bought me a copy of that book. He knew I loved it, but and he was really grateful. He bought me a copy as a gift, and I still treasure it. It's in my. I've got a favorite book pile, and that one's in there. 1967. Henry Plea. I didn't pronounce his name very well. I don't speak French. Well, I speak schoolboy French, but he referred to the Ten No Kata as a particularly pure kata. So he clearly held it in high regard and actually published it in French in 1967, which it was a fulsome edition in the UK, in England. I think probably about the same time, so you find the kata published there. You find it published in 1935 in the Karatedo Kihon, and then you find it published again in 1943 in Donaemon. But interestingly, it's absent in Rentan Goshin Karate Jutsu, which is, I think, 1925. So we can see it's probably cropped up, been created sometime between 25 and 35.
You mentioned that it's not practiced generally in Shotokan anymore, but they do practice everything in it. So they march. There's the marching up and down, isn't there, as part of the Kihon practice. So all of the content is still, the Ippon, Sanbon, and Gohon kumite are really the 1, 3, and 5 step kumites are really derived from Ten No Kata practice. So it's still kind of the content of it, the material is still alive and well, even if the kata isn't generally practiced anymore. And Gichin Funakoshi are not necessarily as popular anymore. People tend to gravitate towards Choki Motobu because he's sort of perceived as a real fighter or something like that. But it's really quite brilliant, the Ten No Kata, because can you think of a kata that presents the basics of karate any better? And I don't think there is. I think he did a better job, with his son. I think they did a better job than Itosu did, or any of the other so-called style founders. They haven't created something that's had a greater impact as the Ten No Kata. And as I mentioned, it's a way of accessing the antique forms from a ballistic perspective. You've got your strikes, you've got your distances. It's a clever way of it's a clever approach, and it's interesting to read in one of Henning Witwer's books him talk about that the Ten No Kata was supposed to be the first of 3. There were going to be 3 of these. The original plan was there were going to be 3 of these kata: Ten No Kata, Jin No Kata, and Chi No Kata. I'd be really curious what those other 2 would have been like, as well as presentations of the basics. But the thinking's clear, and it's so nice to have a kata where the function's also presented, because it's not that long after the Pinan katas are created without any functions, recorded or passed on to that Gichin Funakoshi comes forward and actually creates a great basics form, but also has a function for it. The function's clear, it's well recorded, you can't go wrong with it. You can have a complete karate practice from it. So it's great maybe not what someone wants to do, but it's I think it's brilliant. And it's also worth mentioning, Nathan, as well, I think Henning Witwer's translation of the introduction to karate, it's the translation and analysis. There's some really in-depth research gone into that, which opens up a huge amount of Gichin Funakoshi's thinking, and by explaining what he was referring to and a lot of the cultural references. So it's a great translation to do a deep dive into for anyone that wants to explore the stories, anecdotes, or the Kihon explanations, the attitude as well that Gichin Funakoshi talks about that one should have when standing in yoi. Bravery of the heart is one of the way I think he describes it, stepping forward. And it's good, wholesome stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other an important point to raise from that is also that as a set of quotes basics, it's reflected across hundreds of arts, hundreds of karate styles, because they're in their hundreds now and growing. But they all present with a set of basics, and those basics, as you alluded to Tom, are uncannily similar to what's condensed in the Ten No Kata. So an individual block will be practiced, stepping backwards and forwards and marching up and down, and it will be repeated in there'll be lots of repetitions. It's called training. And it's interesting that blueprint actually became karate. I'd go so far as to say it is karate, because it and it's more than karate. I'll just digress for a moment and look at the Korean. Be careful here. Get my terminology. Taekwondo. Let's just call it that. And I think it was General Choi, Tom, that he was in 19. So General Choi was actually in World War II. Was actually signed. He was actually in the Japanese military, not the Korean. He was in the Japanese military. In 1943, when he at the end of World War II, he joined the Korean military, and that's when he was promoted eventually to general. But actually, he was a second dan in Shotokan under Funakoshi Gichin Sensei. So it's no surprise that the basics of Taekwondo, and I forget which. Sorry, I might need a prompt. I don't know if it's ITF. It factionalized, and I'm not au fait with Taekwondo politics, but the group that stayed with the kata and the traditional approach, because I know one faction completely dropped kata, which kind of makes sense because they're doing a free sparring based high kicking style of martial arts, and so somebody decided that we don't need these kata, but the group that stuck to the kata still had the same approach that fundamentally that Shotokan and other karate had, breaking things down into marching up and down, blocking and punching and kicking, and basically it was Funakoshi Sensei's approach, which found its way into Taekwondo and pretty much every other punch block ballistic based percussive martial art method. In fact, and I know from personal experience, it strayed over into Kung Fu, into how Kung Fu teachers chose to teach. The intricate forms of Kung Fu had the same, were as problematic in terms of interpretation as the enigmatic karate kata. So Kung Fu, I think, was profoundly influenced by Funakoshi Gichin Sensei's Shotokan approach, not directly, but second hand and third hand, and historically that seems to be the case, that Funakoshi Sensei's creation of Ten No Kata influenced the entire world of ballistic unarmed percussive martial arts.
Yeah, I can vouch for that. Having done Lao Gong and seen in my early days, it was very similar to some of that stuff, with forms that you couldn't actually follow, but the actual practice and did have that basic framework, the blocking and punching and walking up and down. It's the same stuff, really. Yeah, it was the same stuff. In Whitwer's translation, he makes the comparison as well, just in terms of influences. He compares some really interesting images from Jacob Happel's Art of Boxing from 1863, which it looks there's stepping with a lunge punch and stepping back in a kind of gedambarai, in a kind of fudodachi as well, the stance. So that there may have been a European influence on the development as well, the ideas of stepping and blocking in there, and then that kind of exploded in the karate world into all the other martial arts. It's hard for imagine martial arts without stepping, punching, blocking, and countering, and most of the bunkai that exists today really exists in that format as well. Someone throws a punch, even though it's more nuanced and tricky now. It's still fundamentally exactly the same pattern. Someone steps and attacks, and someone steps. So yeah, those influences running through it and where it went is quite amazing, really.
An important distinction or point, rather, to make in respect of Ten No Kata. So it has two parts to it, omote and ura. So the first part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is contains the basic movements, and part 2 the applications. And it's interesting that the whole practice is based on Funakoshi Jichin's insistence on karate nisenti nashi. There is no first. That sente doesn't actually. It's translated carelessly as there is no first attack, which is easy for foreigners, for us non-Japanese to understand. There is no first attack, but karate sente is an initiative. But actually, we find that in other kata, particularly, for example, in Naihenshin, the reverse is true. So we can see this almost passive, blocking, defensive art of karate really occurring with the genesis of Ten No Kata. I like Tom's positive take on it because, but I spent years practicing Ten No Kata, so in fact, my whole transition from Kung Fu to karate, anecdotally, began with an assiduous study of Ten No Kata, a quasi-religious devotion to it, and practiced it every which way. In the soft Shotokai way, I practiced it in in a Shotokan way, and I practiced it. So I was quite attached to it, though. I'm grateful for the respect that which Tom has accorded to the kata. And I was having a chat with Matt earlier, in which Matt asked some just really excellent questions. But of course, he's very experienced and has his own understanding, because he was there right on board years ago and was involved in the practice of Ten No Kata himself, as indeed were we all. Everyone in the present conversation has had considerable experience of practicing the Ten No Kata.
I think as well, it sort of has this place for people that were and perhaps more interested in practicing Karatedo rather than, this sort of the modern obsession with everything has to be a functional fight. That would never work in a street fight, self-defense. It's sort of a bit tiring, everything being viewed and practiced through that lens. Having a simple practice, which is the kind of the foundation really of all karate and a lot of martial arts, something like Ten No Kata can be practiced without too much concern about its value in a street fight. And I think it potentially offers something else. And, again, just returning very briefly to the introduction to karate, is clear in there that Gichin Funakoshi's vision didn't really, for karate, wasn't and particularly the Ten No Kata, wasn't paying too much attention to its value in a street fight or combative efficiency. There's something more he's talking about in there about the benefits of approaching Karatedo, as a way, a practice, perhaps with a spiritual element for some or something like that, or the qualities and principles of Budo. For the individual, you can take that however you like, but it certainly had an influence, and Chinese philosophy certainly had an influence on Gichin Funakoshi, and you find references to that in the introduction to karate as well. So it's in terms of what it might unlock for as a foundational practice for karate. I think the potential for it lies, there's lots of possibilities. And it goes beyond it perhaps not, well, it almost certainly not being that combatively efficient or useful.
And there's a potential majesty, and nobility to the art of Karatedo, which Funakoshi Sensei, I think, championed. I don't know if he pioneered it. I suspect he did. But there's a majesty to it. And as I think I wrote about 35 years ago, that, I don't train. I don't practice every day. I don't, just in case of the odd punch up. That would be a weird, obsessive, kind of paranoid approach to life. I'm going to, practice karate every day in case I get a fight. Crikey. I'm in my late 60s, so, hopefully I'm less at risk of getting into a fight now than I ever have been. Oh, one never knows in the current climate. But I haven't had the obsession, the training. I've enjoyed the training. I've loved it. I've felt the way, the way. I'm not making any claims to excellence or mastery or anything like that. I'm simply saying that I felt that there's a beauty in the experience. And I'll put it in a very crude way. I'm not a big food eater, but if I do, who doesn't like something that's of quality? So there must be, a treat that everybody likes to have, and one doesn't sit down and say, well, I've been eating for years and I'm sick of eating. I don't want to keep eating. It's just a normal thing, but you eat everything that you experience, and I don't want to cause a problem for anyone with food allergies or problems. But the reality is that you don't regret your favorite food. And for some people, and you might have to control the interest in indulgence. But the reality is that you don't get bored of that. And it's the same with karate. It's an ongoing process, and some people do eat just to live, but some people enjoy their food too. And many people who practice karate just love karate, and that's a lot healthier than any paranoid obsession with self-defense or doing violence to others, no matter how much we believe they might deserve it. Yeah.
I think that also that there's a pretty strong case that Ten No Kata might be almost one of the, if not the first, one of the only pure karate kata, because the antique forms, for the most part, Naihanshin excluded, all have something to do with weaponry in varying contexts. So Kusanku is the bow, Asai is something to do with the bow, Ojushiho is tonfa, Sanshin Seisan Sensei Ryu is sai, Chinto, we'll come back to that. None of them are karate in what we would know to be karate. And the Pinans are a mishmash of those antique forms, and that's not to criticize them but if they're a mix of weapons content, they're not karate. So when does karate really begin, and with what? And the Ten No Kata is just it's a pure empty hand kata, and it was always meant to be practiced unarmed, and the function comes along with the kata unarmed. So it's almost, you could put a pin in that and go, that's when karate really, really is formalized or standardized. And Ten No Kata might be one of the very first pure unarmed karate kata in existence.
That's quite an inspiring angle, in fact, isn't it, really? And in fact, if the functions of the antique forms had never been passed, well, they weren't passed down. If the functions had been passed down, if the functions of the antique forms had been passed down, it wouldn't be, Ten No Kata wouldn't exist.
No, because it
wouldn't be a need for it.
Well, you'd used to be doing whatever the antique forms were.
Yeah. And then if Ten No Kata didn't exist, you wouldn't have karate.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe. Yeah. But it's sort of like a milestone in formalizing, well, what have we got? What can we do with Naihanchi in terms of ballistic striking? Not a great deal. It's not a good starting point. I know it's unarmed, there's grappling, but those other forms that they're not organized in a way that's a representation of anything unarmed. So you've got this kind of moment where Ten No Kata appears, and it's ordered and the function's clear, and it's the first clear representation of all of that. And they use it as a leaping off point to do something with the antique forms. So we know they didn't know what they were for, because they're using Ten No Kata as an access route. Oizuki, reverse punch. Everything becomes one-step bunkai. Someone attacks, I know you've got grabs and things later on, and it becomes more complex, but even, as I've already said, some of the most elaborate and clever bunkai you see today are still against a stepping punch. So, it's I think it's the emergence of Ten No Kata is the emergence of karate as we know it. And it's a really important kata. And it's an important part of history. So yeah, I think it's a great piece of work.
Any questions, Matt?
No, I don't have any questions. I think that's all been really well said. I personally, I would look at, based on what's just been said, I'd consider Ten No Kata to be almost the starting point of a different mentality. It's the embodiment of a different approach to what is presented by the inherited kata. It does represent a marked difference in approach, in an attempt to embody something different, and that's not to take away from it at all. Some people very much enjoy that kind of practice. I do think it is quite a significant departure from the antique forms in terms of what it's seeking to embody. I won't say any more on that. It's just different. It's not, it's not a positive or a negative thing. But it is a departure.
That's a really good point, because you've got the applied Ten No Kata. It involves stepping back and blocking, and that's a huge departure from the antique forms, which are fundamentally going first and forwards. So there's something completely different emerges in that, and it affects the psychology and the mindset of it all, and the emerging philosophy of practice, and all of the courtesy and
Just preempted the question I was about to ask before you spoke, and this kind of summed it up there. But here's a provocative question that I'll address to everyone. Given that the original kata are proactive and preemptive and go first, and generally moving forward, does Ten No Kata represent a potential corruption?
I don't know. Maybe yes and no. If you're sort of a purist from the antique perspective, then yeah. Or if your mindset is it's got to be, fast and furious on the mean streets, then yeah. But seeing it through the lens of Karatedo Nyomon, where there's this Gichin Funakoshi's idea of Karatedo, where the fighting street fighting isn't emphasized, or Goshin Jutsu self-defense isn't particularly emphasized, and there's a lot more to the philosophy and approach and what you're embodying, and then I don't think it is a corruption. I think it's a new direction, a new type of martial art emerging. So I think, yeah, yes and no there, depending on who's kind of looking at it. And again, that's what makes it so great, is that it can be so controversial in that respect, because people that are so invested in self-defense or real fighting will probably, feel nauseous looking at it. And like, well, that would never work. It can kind of bring up so much for different people, whereas someone that's interested in Karate-Do or a more Do type practice or embodied practice or something like that will get so much from it, because they've got a complete form there with its function, and it's pure karate, it's pure empty hand. And it represents that emergence of karate being empty hand rather than China hand. It really embodies that fully. So, I think it's that's part of what makes it so great.
And I think when we were practicing, we emphasised that it was a ritual combat. The idea of a ritual combat, it's not actual combat. The recognition that it's not actual combat.
Yeah. I think it's also kind of, it keeps things in perspective as well. I mean, if you do archery and you're shooting targets, I don't think anyone's under any illusion that they could then go out into, medieval battlefield and somehow be effective, or anything like that. It can be enough to just go and enjoy shooting some targets, and karate can be enough to just practice the challenges in the experience within that framework, and not worry about, well, I'm going to get, I'm going to get my head paved in if I don't practice something really dangerous and deadly. It speaks to something else as well. I think that those other qualities are really, it can be important, and they're not for everyone, and that's fine. It's up to you, the individual, isn't it? But yeah. I was just thinking, Matt, about when we did Jodo, and we trained together, just how much fun it was to do those sequences, and to kind of try and push each other a little bit with a little bit quicker, or just of the time, and when we finished at the end of the session, it's very satisfying. But I don't think we then thought we were somehow then prepared for warfare in medieval Japan.
No, quite.
But the practice itself was enough. And it's just it's a real pleasure. And I think that the same exists in that Karatedo, potentially.
Well, I think, I with any kind of embodied practice, I think there's a nice, it's a nice way of experiencing the mindset of the person that put it together. And so the nice thing about Ten No Kata is Funakoshi Gichin had, his emphasis on the way, something that's bigger than just, functional ballistics. And it's a nice way of entering into that mentality and experiencing something of what he was trying to transmit to people. As with any kind of embodied practice, you inevitably, if you're, mimicking the physical movements of somebody that put that together, you in some way can, or my contention would be, you can at least in some way partake of their mind. When you do it, and that's, that's to me, that's a nice way to think about it, rather than worrying about whether you're going to be able to take it into the hexagon and smash the other guy's face in. Obviously not, and that was never the part of the conceptual framework that Gichin Funakoshi was working with.
He's an educator as well.
Right, and that, do you know what, that shines through. He wanted a practice that was built on well practiced fundamentals, and that's an approach to education. Complicated things. You can master complicated skills by practicing the fundamentals first.
He includes those stories as well of, people squaring off and things like that, and they're kind of like little moral stories, and they give you an insight into what Karate no Sentinash means, and being brave and standing up to, all that kind of standing your ground and all of that stuff. And that's kind of you can embody that in the practice. Those, you can play with it and experience it. And there's a good reason why he put those stories into the Karatedo Nyomon, and why the anecdotes are in there as well, and why the explanations are so clear. And he's referring to some Chinese philosophy and some Budo, and it's kind of creating. It's that you can see the emerging karate, and he was competing against very, very well. He's competing, trying to establish karate in the midst of the Kodokan, the judo, and the kendo, and he did, and now it's practiced by tens of millions around the world, and it all kind of comes out of those early 20 years that he was there.
Yeah, I mean, he clearly understood the importance of storytelling.
I think he was drawing on lots of so there's that boxing manual mentioned, the Jacob Apple manual, but there were lots of those things circulating. There was lots of the European military manuals and things like that all circulating. And certainly the Japanese martial arts obviously played a huge role in the development of Shotokan as well. And that's being quite well documented now as well. It's really quite fascinating. So yeah, he's drawing together lots and lots of material, and also addressing some of the problems. You've got all these kata, but you've got no applications. We're doing China hand, but what is it we're really doing? How are we doing this? And then you've got all of the interactive budos in Japan. We better get some of that in there, otherwise it's not going to last very long, because people aren't going to want to just do kata. So he's really progressive and moving with the times, and Ten No Kata is a kind of shining moment of that progressiveness, and a moment in the development of karate. A real key moment in karate history. And it informs us a lot about the antique forms as well, indirectly. And if you take away the antique forms, where does karate as empty hand really begin? Where do those kata really begin? And yeah.
Well, I'd like to answer my own question. So I think it's not for corruption. It is karate. But I think I'm going to do a slightly easy to identify it in a slightly lazy way, but I think it is Karatedo, the way of karate, as opposed to what I think that existed before, or would be demonstrated in the proactive kata, for instance, of Naihanshin, and the kata that Tom has described, the Kusanku, the Kinto, and so on. These are not reactive at all. They're proactive, and I think it's a bit careless, but we could call those karate jutsu. And not with an idea that that's somehow more effective in karate do, but there's a different emphasis. And we had a challenge ourselves in practicing Naihanshin, and we put it in a pushing hands framework. If we look at the pushing hands of Kodoru, we have a way that we can express kata techniques without prearranging. And we can do them by touch, by contact reflex, particularly things like Rokushu, Tensho. Wonderful. We can do the same with Sanshin, and similar with Naihanshin. But this, in effect, is turning those techniques into karate do, which is the way that Funakoshi Sensei uncovered and pointed out. So to answer my own question, I don't think that Ten No Kata is a corruption, but it is a significant change in direction from karate Jutsu, or the technique, clinical technique, particularly proactive policing, to a do, or a way of training, so in that regard, as long as Ten No Kata is seen as a do, it's not a corruption at all.
That brings us to the end of our deep dive into Ten No Kata. A brilliant linear creation that gave beginners a clear starting point, codified the basics, and fundamentally shifted the martial art from Jutsu, technique, to Do, the way. It established a coherent system of basics, provided a ballistic key to unlock the antique forms, and paved the way for modern Karatedo by emphasizing training over combative efficiency. Funakoshi Sensei's vision was truly progressive. It truly is a key moment in karate history. If this conversation broadened your understanding of the art, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next episode. For further reading, check out the links in our show notes, including resources on Funakoshi's Karatedo Naemon. And as always, thank you for listening.